Oh, hello there, and welcome to the Saturday stream here on Adam's Music Box. Today, it's a drummer's stream. Some of you on this channel have asked before if I play any instruments, and I do slash did. Not really active much anymore, but I was a drummer, some would say. Always will be. Others who had to hear it will say never should have been. But when it comes to the drums, it's a very interesting fraternity because there are a lot of misconceptions about rhythm. And the function of rhythm is incredibly different depending on what genre you're in. For instance, as I've said before, in European classical music, it's the melody and even the harmony which must shape the rhythm. And the great performers, and in particular the great maestros, the great conductors in Western Europe, in European classical music, they understand this. And in other forms of music, particularly jazz derived music, it's the rhythm that forms and shapes the melody. And because of that, the maestros of jazz derived music, drummers, must have a very keen and intricate sense of melody if they're going to be able to accomplish that wonderful creation of melody using instruments that are generally not tuned to a specific pitch, and hence you have the drummer. Now, why do I say jazz rather than rock? Well, in the context of drums in particular, all all styles of drumming that involve the contemporary drum set evolve from jazz. Now, it's true that you could potentially be, and in many cases could be, an electric guitar player in a rock band and be more influenced by classical music or blues, which itself influenced jazz, but you might not have an intimate knowledge of jazz. But to be a good drummer at the drum set, as opposed to, let's say, a timpanist, a master drummer playing various hand percussion instruments from Africa, a gamelan drummer or percussionist, let's say, from Indonesia, to play the modern westernized drum set, it all begins with jazz. Which is why when you hear interviews with some of the great rock drummers, when great rock drumming really became a thing in the late '60s, all of them talk about growing up listening to Buddy Rich and Gene Krupa, and some of the ones with more youthful tastes talk about Art Blakey and Max Roach and Philly Joe Jones, etc. Tony Williams, who was very young, he could have been in the rock generation, but you get what I'm getting at. Now, Phil Collins was someone who was interested in drums very early on. And the purpose of this video, and what makes that clear, is the fact that a new documentary all about Phil Collins and his drumming has just been released. It's available on YouTube. The title is Phil Collins Drummer First, which is an appropriate title because that is always how he thought of himself. It's released from Drumeo, and perhaps most interestingly, it's produced and hosted by a fellow drummer, someone that Phil has known all his life because it's his son, Nick Collins himself. And we'll get to that and why that's important in just a little bit. But when it comes to Phil's experience with drumming, he had a love affair with drums at a very early age. His parents got him a kind of ramshackle kit when he was a kid, and he loved playing it, even though his first sort of professional career, if you will, was on the stage as a child actor. He was in Oliver, as we all know, and all of that. But he turned his back on the acting world. He sort of slipped back into it in the 80s, but he turned his back on the acting world at the end of the 60s and looked for regular gigs as a professional drummer. And we all know the story of his audition for Genesis in 1971, I believe, early 1971. Genesis as a band were around since '67 because they were a school band. Mike Rutherford, Tony Banks, Peter Gabriel, and Anthony Phillips all went to the same school. And they were all from relatively well off backgrounds, and they formed a school band, and it was called Genesis. But there was always a bit of instability behind the drum throne, and they needed someone who was really professional. Their first proper album came in 1970. That was Trespass, but they needed to kick things up a notch. And it was around that same time that Ant Phillips, the original guitar player, who was very good, but he developed stage fright, which they were now in need of both a drummer and a guitarist. Well, the drummer came first, and this was Phil Collins. And Peter Gabriel was always sort of Phil's biggest cheerleader in the band, because Peter fancies himself as something of a drummer himself. He's always kicking a bass drum around when he was with Genesis, tambourines galore, muracas, and all the rest of it. But Peter Gabriel definitely has a keen ear for percussion, as his solo work makes very clear. It's very explicit in that the melody is being shaped by the percussion on all of his great solo hits and in most of his great solo albums. And so the story goes that Peter said to the other guys after the fact that he knew Phil was the guy to join the band from the way he set up his kit and even from the way he sat down, which is interesting. It leads me to believe that the other drummers auditioning to be in Genesis were really, really bad if they didn't even instill, a modicum of confidence in the others the way they sat down. But be that as it may, Phil earned it because not only could he sit down very well, but he was even then a really, really good drummer. He played southpaw, which means that his left hand is the dominant hand and does on the drums what most drummers would use their right hand for. Now, there are of course some left-handed drummers that play in a right-handed style. Phil Collins is not one of them. He's a left-handed drummer that uses his left hand as his dominant hand and sets up the drum kit in the opposite way. So the hi-hat would be to the right as you're sitting down behind the drums, as opposed to on the typical right-handed drum set when it's on the left. Those of you in the audience who are drummers already know that. But Phil's journey was very, very special. Dave Brown says lots of great musicians are left-handed. That's true, and there should be a show about that. I mean, Jimi Hendrix is one. I'm trying to think of other famous left-handed drummers. I'm drawing a blank, but I know there's plenty of them. Phil might be one of the more famous ones, but yeah, good suggestion, Dave. One of these days we'll have to do a famous show on left-handed musicians for something like a trumpet. Or even to a degree of saxophone, it wouldn't matter as much. But for things like guitar, for things like bass, for drums, certainly matters a lot. For keyboards, it's an interesting one because visually you might not from afar be able to see it, but there is the dominant and less dominant hand among keyboard players. Keith Emerson, for instance, I don't know if he was left handed, but he was famous for having a left hand as fast as most pianists' right hand. So that's a fun little aside. So Phil Collins really injected great skill behind the drum set for Genesis. And even though Genesis were the quintessential prog rock band, one of the bands that helped invent the genre as we know it, Phil was listening in the 70s to things like Mahavishnu Orchestra with the great Billy Cobham on the drums in the original lineup, things like Return to Forever, things like Weather Report. Phil said in this really interesting interview that if there was one musician that he would have loved to have played with that he didn't get the opportunity, it would have been the late Joe Zawinul, who was the co-founder of Weather Report. Along with Wayne Shorter. They were the consistent members of that band. Joe on the keys, Wayne, of course, on the saxophone. And between the two of them, they wrote most of the Weather Report compositions. So we can see where Phil's head is at. While Peter Gabriel, Mike Rutherford, and Tony Banks, and to a degree Steve Hackett, were very much in the very English, very European style of almost neo-romantic progressive rock, Phil's mind was very much in jazz fusion, a genre which is arguably the most athletic and the most demanding for a modern drum set drummer. And just look at all of the drummers I've talked about who have played in those bands: Tony Williams, Billy Cobham, Michael Narada Walden, Lenny White, Alphonse Mouzon, just to name a very few, all of whom are drummers that were amazing. You could say Simon Phillips fits into that mold to a degree as well. But Phil was definitely psychologically in that world. And looking at the skill that he brought onto the drums, you can see it. Now, weirdly, the early Genesis stuff, while it didn't sell as many records as the later stuff, there's a lot of really good video documentary of this band, this original, well, not original, but the five-man lineup of Gabriel, Banks, Rutherford, Hackett, and Collins. There was something they did on Belgian TV not long after Phil joined. They did a film at Shepperton Studio outside of London. They were on the Midnight Special very famously, and the original master tapes have obviously been found by Burt Sugarman's people. They're on YouTube now. For years, there was a sort of what looked like a fifth generation copy, but now we've got the real McCoy. And there were others that were all really good. They were on TV Jimmy, Jimmy to You and Me, a French TV show. And so there's a lot of visual documentary footage of this band. And if you couldn't tell from the albums, Phil is a monster drummer. Um, in terms of a single drum track that I would recommend, I would say for the early Genesis stuff, listen to Dancing with the Moonlit Night from the Selling England by the Pound album. The intricacy of the drumming there is amazing. We all know what happened next. I don't know if I need to repeat the story because everyone knows it, but for those of you who are living under a rock or a Gen Z, same thing. Kidding. I'll repeat it. So Peter Gabriel was the lead vocalist. He wanted to make conceptual films and thought the band was holding him back. Some of the guys in the band didn't like all of the costumery on stage, and so they parted ways. So it was friendly. It wasn't like a Pink Floyd type of thing or a Fleetwood Mac where everyone's married type of thing. It wasn't like that. But they needed a singer and they couldn't find one because they auditioned singers and they weren't very good. Now, Phil had sung a lot of backup and a couple of numbers where he sung lead. Usually these were sort of acousticy numbers, but the guy had a voice, but they weren't sure if he was the right voice. But because all of the people who auditioned were so bad, they thought, hell, let's just have Phil be the singer. So they recorded what I think is one of my two favorite Genesis albums, A Trick of the Tail. They recorded it in 75 as a four-piece with Phil both doing the drums and doing the vocals. And then they repeated the same shenanigan when they wanted to go on tour. They thought, well, we need Phil to play at the drums. We need a lead singer standing out in front. So they went through the same audition process. And again, it didn't bear fruit. Now, it was around this time that Phil was also involved in a somewhat culty, but relatively successful jazz fusion band of his own, a UK-based jazz fusion band called Brand X. If you want to get a good introduction to them, check out their album Moroccan Roll, spelled like the North African country, but more rock and roll. Get it? Um, and so Bill Bruford was doing some sort of auxiliary percussion work for Brand X. And he said to Phil, I'll tell you what, you go out there and sing and I'll play the drums. And that worked out for two reasons. One, because Bill Bruford is a great drummer. Not many people could play Phil's parts, and Bill didn't try. Bill did it his way. But the point is, these guys were sort of co-equals in terms of great drummers who were well known in the progressive rock genre. And that's also sort of, that segues into reason too. Bill Bruford was someone who would be accepted by the very critical Genesis audience of the day. It wasn't some Johnny come lately. It was someone with credentials. And the tour went really well. And then, as we know, they recorded what I think is the best Genesis album ever, Wind and Weathering from 1976. And it was here that they found someone who I wish participated in this documentary. I know that maybe 10 years ago, their decades long friendship kind of came to an end. And this is Chester Thompson. Now, Chester Thompson was someone who had played in one of Phil's favorite bands. He had played in Weather Report, which automatically made Phil love him. And he also played with Frank Zappa. For a while, as the only drum set drummer, there was obviously Ruth Underwood, who played mallet percussion and other percussion at that time. But when Chester first joined up with Frank Zappa, there were two drummers on a traditional drum set. There was Ralph Humphrey and there was Chester Thompson. And Phil really liked what Chester and Ralph did as dual drummers, this drumming duo. And that, of course, the dueling drums, the drum duo stuff that Chester and Phil did became a staple of Genesis shows once Chester joined the band as a touring member. He never played on a studio album, but he was at every Genesis tour from Wind and Weathering right up until, well, we'll get to that, but he was there basically forever. and the audiences accepted him because even though Zappa and Weather Report were very different, frankly, from each other, but both were really different from the prog rock Genesis was doing, he was accepted because he was playing in bands that were universally musically respected. So they didn't miss a step at all with that. Chester became part of the band very quickly. Now, from this era, definitely check out Unquiet Slumbers for the Sleepers and In That Quiet Earth. It's the percussive part begins in That Quiet Earth from side B of the Wind and Weathering album, because that drumming is fantastic. And as a young drummer growing up, it was the kind of thing I would listen to and attempt to replicate. Not the easiest thing to replicate. Sign of a good drummer. He makes something that sounds so appropriate, so musical, so melody shaping, which is, of course, the key role of a drummer in all jazz based genres. And as I said, even in rock, the drumming is always jazz based to one degree or another. Makes it sound easy. It is not easy. Of course, on that album also there was What Gorilla, which was a song that Phil kind of pushed on the band to sort of push them in a more Brand X-y, Mahavishnu-y direction. I think it really worked. It was a short instrumental number, but it really worked. But all of the drumming on that album is really good. And then the following album was, and then there were three because Steve Hackett left, and they became a trio. And the opening track to that album, which Phil kind of disparaged because it's not easy to replicate live, it's very very physical, a lot of exercise that goes into that. But the song Down and Out, the opening track from And Then There Were Three, one of the hardest drum tracks ever. And again, it's so deceiving. And it's not just because of the odd time signatures involved, it's because of what Phil is doing between the beats, if you will. Really, really complex and sophisticated drumming. Now, let me quickly talk about the actual shape of this documentary. It's 2 hours long, and it's centered around a father-son interview, with Phil being interviewed by his son Nick, who is a drummer himself, a very good drummer, and clearly someone who's super curious about the history of drumming, about his father's experience. You can feel the sincerity, not just because they're father and son, but because they both love the drums. And there's a lot of interesting stuff that shows Nick and some of the road crew setting up some of Phil's old sets. Unlike Alex Van Halen and Bill Bruford, it looks like Phil has hung on to his old sets. They plug in some of the old Simmons drums, which is really interesting. And just seeing all of Phil's sets up close and personal in the light rather than on a dark stage, it's really cool for a drummer, at least. And obviously, there's the elephant in the room, which they address. So it really isn't the elephant in the room; it's the elephant in the zoo. Where is an elephant acknowledged? I don't know the opposite of that phrase, and maybe Grok can tell me. But they acknowledge the fact that I mean, close to 10 years now, Phil hasn't been able to play the drums. He's got joint problems, back problems, a foot problem, and it's old age. Even though there are older drummers, I mean, Roy Haynes, who died this year, was older. But again, it's genetics, it's luck. Something that Nick noticed is that Phil had his seat, his drum throne, as they call it, very, very low. So he was playing sort of a bit like this, not as much as B.J. Wilson, the wonderful drummer from Procol Harum and Joe Cocker, who was known as the octopus in a bathtub because it was like this. Great, great drummer, by the way. But there was a bit of that, and after tour, it is certainly one of the things that strained Phil's back. But Nick very capably fills in for Phil, playing some of the most well-known drum parts. And one thing I noticed, that maybe it's a silver lining, is it looks like, maybe because of YouTube and its insane monetization policies, people ask me sometimes, why are you talking about the music? Why don't you play the song? Well, I would, but I'm trying on this new channel to get monetized, and YouTube doesn't like it when you do that. The reason that people like Rick Beato are able to do it is he doesn't really get monetized. His YouTube channel functions from a business point of view, as a place to sell his educational resources, his books, etc. But even some of his videos get taken down, even though he's not even trying to make money off of them. So I've done a video about how they need to change this from an opt-in system to an opt-out system in terms of the artists and licensing their rights for things like this, but that's to revisit another day. So anyway, the primary platform that this documentary was uploaded is YouTube, and maybe it's for that reason. Maybe the record companies didn't want to license the music, even though I think Phil, with the other guys in Genesis, and certainly for his own stuff, I think he owns the master right. So maybe I don't know what the reason is. Maybe it's a legal thing. Maybe it's because Drumeo was technically producing the video rather than Phil himself. I smell a lawyer, okay? I'll put it that way. But they made up for that because Nick basically, I think he may have had earphones in. He was playing the drums. I'm guessing listening to the backing recording and replicating the parts that his father had played. And there were parts where he said, "Well, did you do it this way or did you do it that way?" And Phil said, "Oh, no, I did it the second way or I did it the first way." And again, it's all very interesting because these are questions that a lot of drummers ask. How exactly did he do it? Was it like this? Was it like this? And that really is explained with very good high definition video details so you can see how those parts were played. And it was really sort of a special sort of Christmas miracle moment for fellow drummers. Now, of course, the Phil Collins of the 80s is the Phil Collins that went from being a respected musician to a celebrity superstar. And there's a very good reason for it. Sometimes democracy works. He was writing and producing amazing solo material. He was shy about songwriting in the 70s, but something happened to him from in the 80s where he got that confidence. And every solo album he did, they all, they fit my list of no filler. Every song is a good song. One hell of a song. I mean, yeah, he's a great singer. We already knew that. But one hell of a songwriter, too. And no slouch on the keyboards either. He's not Herbie Hancock, but he composes at the piano and he really knows how to bring everything together. Got another comment from David in the little comment section. He says it's a shame experimental bands aren't nurtured anymore. Yeah, many went on to make great mainstream pop tracks. Look at the pop hits that came out of Genesis and its members. Absolutely, it's all about one giving opportunities to bands that may not seem mainstream, not second guessing what audiences want to hear, and three, knowing that if you're a virtuoso and a good songwriter, you'll probably have it within you eventually to write that hit single. As the guys in Genesis said, and as the guys in Pink Floyd said too, it is much harder to write a really memorable, snappy, good 3 minute 4 minute pop song than it is to sort of take a 12-minute multi-section piece and make it interesting. And there's some truth to that. But as David, you absolutely correctly say, if you've got that within you, experience will eventually lead you to that holy grail, if you will, of a 3 minute song that you can put on the radio and everyone can sing along to. And I do think that maybe hanging around, relentless songwriters like Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford did help Phil, because one thing that's interesting about Phil's songwriting is he has a wonderful sense of chord development. So did Genesis when he wasn't writing any of the music. So maybe that rubbed off on him, because even though the style of his solo music is quite different than Genesis, that really rich, sophisticated, evolved chord harmonic development, harmonic structure, it's there in just about all of Phil's main songs. And Phil also makes it very clear, as I said, that in this genre of music, it is the percussion, it is the rhythm that shapes the melody. Totally opposite of things like Beethoven or Wagner, where it's the melody shaping the rhythm. And Phil gets that because you can hear it in his playing. You can hear how his drumming, whether he's doing something simple or whether he's doing something like wild, like on Down and Out, for instance, it's always in the service of melody. It's always in the service of shaping the song. Truly an exceptional drummer. And one of the other things I admire about him is his work ethic. In the 80s, he was one of the busiest guys in the music industry. He was making solo albums where he wrote, produced, played keyboards, played drums. He was then touring those albums. He was in Genesis, who had the biggest selling albums of the 80s, and they were touring all over the world in stadiums and huge arenas and everything. He was playing and producing on people like Robert Plant, huge superstar in his own right, producing Nothing But the Sun. Um, that's what it's called. I'm having a bit of a Joe Biden moment. No, that's a Sting album. What's the one that Clapton did about the Behind the Sun? Nothing. Yeah, go easy on me, folks. But that I actually speak. I think Behind the Sun is probably Clapton's best album of that particular era, and it sounds very Phil Collins. If someone said, "What would it sound like if Eric Clapton had an album produced by Phil Collins?" Well, that's what it sounds like. They both delivered, and it was really good. He did other work with Clapton in the 80s. He played with so many different people at that time, and I think that one of the things that this documentary brought out that most people don't talk about is just how much sort of session work he did. Obviously, he co-wrote Loco and Acapulco with the Four Tops for the Buster soundtrack, where he was an actor again as well. That helped to revive their already legendary career. As I said, he did a lot with Philip Bailey from Earth, Wind, and Fire. Um, he did the drums on Band Aid. Do They Know It's Christmas? We'll talk about that in a couple of days on a Christmas episode. Of course, the place where that gated drum sound that went on to define the 80s. I've done a video all about that if you want to check it out on Peter Gabriel's third album. And then he took it, of course, even further on his solo albums, that gated drum sound, the sound of all the 80s pop and rock and soul to a degree music. So you can't overlook the stuff he did with Peter Gabriel post Genesis. I mean, the list just goes on. He played with Argent. Um, so much good stuff. Brian Eno. So I think that one of the things that this document, Tears for Fears, which I'd forgotten all about, he played on the song Woman in Chains. One of the things this documentary really brought out that I love is how much drumming he did for other people as a producer or as a sideman. That work ethic is really, really special. The music press are snobs, particularly in Europe, and they really knocked him for that. But that's just really horrible because there's nothing better in music than just playing as much as you can and having that work ethic and giving it your all, whether you're a sideman, whether you're in part of a huge band like Genesis, whether you're doing solo work. And by the 90s, the musical landscape had changed and the critics were, they had their knives out for Phil. But by the late 90s, he was back doing soundtracks. And he went from maybe in the mid 90s, the lowest point in his career in terms of critical and press perception. He was still being played on the radio. But by the late 90s, he was back. And Tarzan was, of course, one of the biggest soundtracks ever. You'll Be in My Heart, a very sophisticated song, especially for what ostensibly was a kids' movie. And he won an Oscar. And I thought, well, I don't really care about awards, but I thought it was good because it shut up the critics. I wish that the guys in South Park could have won too. That started a very funny rivalry between Phil Collins and the South Park guys. I love them both. But there you go. And then he went on to do other work with Disney. He did the Brother Bear soundtrack, and he cemented himself as the guy who could write a song for all occasions. He continued to tour. Genesis got back together in 2007, but that was sort of the last time that we really got to see him behind the drums in earnest, because it was on that tour where he pushed himself physically to the limits. And there's even a documentary about that tour. And during the rehearsals, he was quite frustrated because he couldn't play some of the stuff he used to. And he worked on himself and he sounded really good on the tour, but that really pushed him over the edge. And it was something that happened a few years after it when he did a Motown tribute album. And he was doing the vocals, but it was Chester on the drums, because Chester had been the drummer for all of his live bands, not just Genesis, but all of his solo stuff. But Phil got frustrated that he couldn't play, and he let out some of those frustrations on Chester, which ended a friendship of what, 35, 40 years. And that maybe is why, while a lot of the other people that were central to his life were in this documentary, Chester wasn't, which was kind of sad. It would be really nice, because no one lives forever, for the two of them to sort of make up, because their drumming stories are so intertwined. And don't get me wrong, they did loads of interesting stuff alone. They are drummers who stand on their own merits, but double drumming being something of a rarity, you could argue that Phil and Chester were among the most memorable drum duos that toured the world many, many times over. So hopefully they can shake hands and get together for a coffee or a beer or whatever. Um, but overall, the documentary, it's a really feel good documentary, which isn't easy because you get to see Phil in, his condition with his back and his foot. It hasn't been easy on him. He's got the cane. His voice doesn't sound as healthy as it used to. He's still got his great sense of humor, but it was just something so wholesome about seeing Nick Collins there with his father, just geeking out over something that they clearly and truly love. And that's the drums. I love it too. Again, if you're not into drums, maybe the documentary isn't for you, but if you're into Phil Collins, or if you're just into learning about really talented and really culturally important musicians, I think maybe this documentary is for you too. Check it out. It's free on YouTube. As always, like and subscribe to this channel, and we will see you next time. Take care.